here to go over the soil analysis report we received back from the lab. And the first thing we're going to go ahead and take a look at is the pH.
So looking at the pH for this soil test report, we're at about 6.1, which isn't really too bad when we consider that our optimal range is 6.0 to 6.8. Obviously, pH can be adjusted probably a little bit higher, maybe closer to 6.3 to 6.5 to make the nutrient availability, at the optimal range that it can be. So generally speaking, though, at a 6.1, unless, you're really having other problems, that's not really going to be something that's going to need to be addressed.
All right, and then I guess similar to that, we see the CEC, or that cation exchange capacity. That's at a 9.
So for this area, a 9 is really not too bad. When we look at CEC, we're really trying to think there about how many nutrients or what amount of nutrients is going to be adsorbed to the soil particles. So basically with a sandy soil, you're really going to see lower CECs, and those nutrients are not going to stick around in that soil very long. When we look at a more silty clay soil, even into the loams and organic soils, that's where we start to see CEC numbers working their way up. So for like a clay loam soil to have a CEC of 9, that's going to give you time to apply nutrients, and then for those nutrients to stick around in the soil and then slowly be released and be available for those plants to take up.
All right, then our next major thing we want to look at is our 3 macronutrients, our nitrogen, our phosphorus, and potassium. We're not super concerned about nitrogen at this point. We actually didn't evaluate that in this sample. But going into soybeans, so soybeans are inoculated, they're going to fixate their own nitrogen, so that's not really a concern. You can see that the report is not recommending that there's any phosphorus added. I'm going to go down and look a little further on the chart. We're at 82 parts per million. The tri-state fertilizer recommendation would be that our soil phosphorus is somewhere between 20 and 40 parts per million. So we're actually twice as high as, we'd really like to see that. So there's no recommendation for that. Moving over to potassium, 115 pounds of that is recommended to be applied. Again, we go down to the next row on that report there, and we see that we're at 83 parts per million. Going back to the tri-state recommendation, the ideal range is that 120 to 170 parts per million in our loam or clay soils. So as we go back and forth between that very top chart and that second row that we've been looking at, we got pounds per acre and parts per million. The easy conversion for that, to go from one to the other if you need to, multiply that parts per million by 2, and that's going to give you your pounds per acre. As we look at phosphorus removal with growing soybeans, for every bushel we're going to remove approximately 0.8 pounds. A rough estimate here in the Wayne County area, about 50 bushels per acre. We're looking at 40 pounds of phosphorus being removed. And then with our potassium, 1.15 pounds per bushel on soybean is removed at a yield of 50 bushels. That'd be about 58 pounds removed. So with those removal rates, it's going to take about 2 years to remove enough phosphorus to get us into that ideal range. A couple other values that are on here are magnesium and our calcium.
So those are 2 numbers that we're going to want to pay attention to based on some interactions between the 2 nutrients. When calcium and magnesium ratios are out of balance, sometimes if the calcium's way too high or the magnesium is way too high, those nutrients can lock each other up and make one unavailable for plant uptake. So in most cases, though, especially with clay soils, the calcium levels can be relatively high and not cause a problem. So we see there that calcium is up around 1,373 parts per million. So might seem high, but for a clay soil, not out of the ordinary. And again, with the magnesium levels there, those seem pretty ideal for a clay soil, with that level of calcium in the soil. So another important ratio that we're going to want to pay attention to is the magnesium to potassium ratio. This ratio should stay above 2 to 1. In other words, we should look at the percent of magnesium saturation to the CEC. It should be twice as much of the percent potassium saturation. So again, when we look at our soil test report, calcium, magnesium, and then the magnesium to potassium ratios should be something that you keep an eye on. So when we think about looking at our soil test report, that's a really great way to get a baseline understanding of what's going on in our fields and have an idea of, what we should plan for and how we should address any kind of nutrient concerns. But then there's some other things that you can do as well. As we get into the growing season, after you've made some amendments, you can go ahead and use like tissue samples or tissue analysis to see, what those plants have really taken up and maybe where they're lacking. Other methods you could use for nitrogen, you could use the nitrogen-rich strips in your cornfields to see, are you applying enough nitrogen, too much nitrogen? You can even use omission plots, maybe have an area of the field where you don't apply nutrients and make for sure that the nutrients you are applying are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
And in closing here, looking at the recommendations given by this lab, again, only potassium is needed in this field for our soybean crop, and that does line up really nicely with our tri-state fertilizer recommendation. That 115 pounds is basically going to cover the crop removal rate of that soybean. So if you're looking to build it, you could add a little bit more, but really these recommendations do fall, again, just real nicely with the tri-state fertilizer recommendations.